What happens when the most brutal regime in modern history rots from the inside out? Behind the iron salute and polished boots was a world of stolen art, forged documents, offshore fortunes, and favors traded like currency. These weren't just war criminals. They were embezzlers, black market kings, and bureaucratic vultures feeding off their own empire. This is the untold story of how the Nazi regime wasn't just evil. It was corrupt to its bones. Welcome to 33 Most Corrupt Nazis, where loyalty had a price tag and even genocide had a ledger. Before we dive in, if dark history and untold power games are your thing, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next deep descent. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it right now? Let's see how far this story travels. And who else is wide awake with us tonight? 1. Hermann Göring. You can build an empire out of fear, but Göring built his out of silk robes, stolen Rembrandts, and 24-karat swagger. As Hitler's right-hand man and head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring didn't just bend the rules. He smoked cigars rolled in them. He wasn't merely corrupt. He industrialized corruption, packaged it with velvet ribbons, and sold it to himself at a markup. His office was a revolving door for art thieves, war profiteers, and anyone who could funnel a few million Reichsmarks into his bottomless pockets. Göring appointed himself plenipotentiary of the 4-year plan, granting himself unchecked access to the German economy, which he looted with such abandon that even his fellow Nazis, hardly saints themselves, muttered behind his back. Every railway shipment he rerouted for personal plunder was a bomb not dropped, a tank not fueled. War was a business, and Göring was its CEO. But he forgot that even empires of gold eventually rust. Which brings us to a man who sold lies for a living and billed the Reich for the cost of the ink. 2. Joseph Goebbels. For someone who preached sacrifice, Joseph Goebbels sure had a taste for imported champagne and lakeside villas. The master propagandist of the Third Reich was less a man and more a walking contradiction. The voice of austerity who dined in opulence, the face of ideology who wore tailored hypocrisy. Through his ministry of propaganda, Goebbels controlled every film reel, radio wave, and newspaper headline, and more importantly, every budget line. Funds meant for morale-boosting campaigns often took curious detours into lavish gifts for his mistress, estates gifted to loyalists, and personal luxuries that would have made Versailles blush. He called it messaging. Others called it fraud. Goebbels understood that perception was everything, and he weaponized it like a scalpel, hiding his grift behind grand speeches and infernos of national pride. But even as Berlin crumbled, his wine cellar remained well stocked. Which begs the question, what do you call a man who lies for a living? In the SS, they had a name for it. They just said it in whispers. If you're still with us, and somehow more intrigued than disturbed, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the dark corners history tried to bury. And hey, since we're trading secrets across time zones, where are you listening from, and what time is it on your end? Let's turn the comments into a global map of midnight minds. 3. Heinrich Himmler. Heinrich Himmler believed in blood, soil, and spreadsheets. The head of the SS ran his empire like a deranged accountant, meticulous, cold, and always looking for a profitable angle. Under his watch, the SS didn't just police the regime, it owned a portfolio. Brick factories, arms plants, construction firms, and entire forced labor systems were converted into financial engines, with Himmler quietly siphoning profit from the suffering of millions. Ideology was the branding. Profit was the product. He created the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office, WVHA, to manage the empire. But in practice, it became a laundering machine, washing brutality into dividends, embezzlement into policy. His private circle knew it. His underlings feared it. Himmler pretended to be the monk of the movement, celibate in public, sanctimonious in tone. But behind the curtain was a man addicted to control and the wealth that came with it, and just beyond him stood another kind of shadow broker, the gatekeeper to Hitler himself. 4. Martin Bormann. Martin Bormann was not a name the average German knew, but every corridor of power echoed with his footsteps. He didn't need parades, medals, or speeches. All he needed was Hitler's ear, and he had it clamped shut in his grip. As the Führer's private secretary, Bormann functioned as gatekeeper, fixer, and silent puppeteer, pulling strings behind velvet curtains while others took the stage. But where there's access, there's leverage, and Bormann leveraged everything. Land transfers, business licenses, inheritance waivers. If it could be signed, it could be sold. And Bormann sold it all, one favor at a time. Entire estates were seized under legal pretense and redirected into his personal orbit. He built a quiet empire on forged signatures and vanishing paper trails. By war's end, his name was more feared in the chancelleries than the Waffen-SS. But for all his power, one man's loyalty would soon turn from mystic to liability, a true believer whose faith fractured governance from the inside. 5. Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess was the ghost in the machinery, ethereal, obsessive, and just detached enough to damage everything he touched. He wasn't flashy like Goering or cunning like Bormann. He was, at first glance, a true ideologue, and that made him dangerous in subtler ways. Hess empowered cultish loyalty within the party, greased the wheels of Hitler's myth-making, and enabled inner circles where reality became a distant rumor. He played the role of deputy Führer like a mystic administrator, promoting favored cronies and ideologues into key positions without regard for competence or consequence. Nepotism wasn't a byproduct. It was the plan. His office became a clearinghouse for irrational appointments, factional infighting, and bureaucratic stalemates. Governance rotted under his influence, not through theft, but through spiritual sabotage. And when he suddenly vanished from the Reich, he left behind a vacuum, one quickly filled by men who knew how to turn paper into power. Men like Hans Lammers, who never met a loophole he couldn't weaponize. 6. Hans Lammers. Hans Lammers didn't march, shout, or scheme. He filed. As head of the Reich Chancellery, Lammers turned legalism into a form of corruption so subtle it often looked like competence. But behind the calm facade was a man engineering a bureaucracy of favors, privileges, and political IOUs. He was the grease in the Nazi legal machine, transforming Hitler's vague decrees into binding policies. Policies that just happened to enrich his friends, empower loyalists, and create overlapping jurisdictions that guaranteed chaos. Chaos he could navigate, of course. Land deals, exemption clauses, forged timelines. Lammers could bend the law like soft copper. He built a career on being indispensable to everyone while accountable to no one. His signature appeared on documents that robbed thousands while lining the pockets of a few. He didn't scream at meetings. He just rewrote the meeting minutes. And quietly, waiting in the wings, was a man who would do all his corruption loud, lewd, and with a grin smeared in ink. 7. Julius Streicher. If the Nazi Party was a criminal syndicate, Julius Streicher was its town lunatic with a printing press. As the publisher of Der Stürmer, Streicher drenched the streets of Germany in venomous propaganda, all while skimming, extorting, and pillaging his way to personal wealth. He didn't just spread hatred, he billed the Reich for it, charged rent on it, and pocketed the change. Streicher abused his power as Gauleiter of Franconia to seize Jewish-owned businesses, confiscate real estate, and funnel donations into his personal coffers. He treated Nuremberg like his private estate, where enemies vanished from property registries and allies mysteriously acquired villas. Even the Nazi leadership, famously lenient with corruption when convenient, eventually had enough. He was stripped of official power not for his ideology, that was encouraged, but for his sheer, shameless greed. Yet somehow, that wasn't the low point. The bar would be lowered even further by a man with a doctorate, a state budget, and a liquor cabinet where morality went to die. 8. Robert Ley. Robert Ley ran the German labor front the way a drunk uncle runs a casino. Loud, erratic, and with absolutely no oversight. As the regime's supposed champion of the worker, Ley siphoned off millions from labor programs while workers toiled in worsening conditions. Entire initiatives like Strength Through Joy, once billed as morale-boosting vacations for loyal citizens, became shell corporations for fraud, self-promotion, and off-the-books excess. Ley's offices were stocked with luxury furnishings, his country estates bloomed like monuments to hypocrisy, and his personal behavior spiraled into public embarrassment. Yet, he retained power because his department still delivered quotas, at least on paper. In reality, Ley's mismanagement sabotaged the very backbone of the Nazi industrial machine, its labor force. But when things broke under his watch, he had a convenient excuse. The saboteurs were everywhere. A useful lie, later repurposed by another official who turned paranoia into an economic strategy and looting into a governing principle. 9. Ernst Kaltenbrunner. Ernst Kaltenbrunner arrived late to the Nazi inner circle, but wasted no time building an empire of corruption under the guise of internal security. As head of the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, he inherited a vast network of fear and monetized it. Bribes flowed through his office like water through a dam about to burst. Passports, prisoner transfers, confiscated valuables. Everything had a price. Kaltenbrunner ran his domain less like a government agency and more like a mafia racket, where guilt could be bought, sentences adjusted, and silence incentivized. Unlike others who masked greed with ideology, Kaltenbrunner made little effort to hide the transactional nature of his power. He understood the machinery of terror and how to skim from every cog. But even he looked modest next to the man orchestrating the largest property theft operation in Nazi-occupied Europe, a man who treated extermination like accounting and kept the profits tax-free. 10. Odilo Globoknik. Odilo Globoknik treated occupied territories like a personal shopping district, with no closing hours and no receipts. As SS and police leader in Lublin, he oversaw some of the most systematic theft operations in the entire regime. Property, valuables, housing, furniture, livestock. If it wasn't nailed down, he confiscated it. If it was nailed down, he brought a crowbar. Under his command, entire administrative networks were redesigned to funnel wealth upward into his pockets and sideways into the pockets of his friends. Even fellow Nazis whispered about Globoknik's appetite for enrichment, partly because he didn't bother to hide it. He built estates, funded pet projects, and surrounded himself with loyalists who understood that efficiency didn't mean good governance, it meant good extraction. His corruption wasn't sloppy, it was methodical. An accountant's version of plunder. And yet, for all his greed, Globoknik still managed to look restrained next to the political prodigy who weaponized bureaucracy like a scalpel and turned loyalty into a commodity traded at the highest levels of the Reich. 11. Reinhard Heydrich. Reinhard Heydrich was corruption in its most elegant form, cold, sharp, and disguised as competence. He didn't steal because he needed to. He stole because control was easier when everything owed you something. As head of the RSHA, Heydrich built networks that rewarded loyalists, punished dissent, and quietly siphoned wealth from occupied regions under the umbrella of state necessity. Intelligence files became bargaining chips. Appointments became currency. Favors acquired interest. People said Heydrich had a mind like a machine, but they forgot machines can be calibrated for profit. He manipulated supply chains, influenced contracts, and granted permissions that just happened to enrich his inner circle. Even his rivals admitted he understood the economics of power better than any banker. But when a man builds an empire on favors, someone has to manage the recruiting booth, the place where influence gets packaged, sold, and stamped with an SS seal. That job fell to someone far less elegant but far more opportunistic. 12. Gottlob Berger. Gottlob. Berger didn't aim for sophistication. He aimed for volume. As chief of SS recruitment, Berger discovered that access to manpower meant access to resources, and that access, in turn, meant leverage. He treated recruitment like a marketplace, where positions, exemptions, and transfers could be negotiated for a price. Some paid with favors, others with loyalty, and a good number with assets that mysteriously changed ownership. Berger blurred the line between official authority and personal gain until the two were indistinguishable on paper. His logistical networks were dense with side deals, redirected supplies, and quietly disappearing inventories. He understood that the SS needed bodies, and bodies needed equipment, and equipment created opportunity. Every shortage was an opening, every new division, a business model. And as his influence spread, so did the corruption inside the SS's industrial empire, paving the way for the man who would turn that empire into a full-scale economic machine built on exploitation and balance sheets that never quite added up. 13. Karl Wolff. Karl Wolff wasn't a strategist or a philosopher. He was a fixer, the kind of man who didn't ask why, only how much. As Himmler's chief of personal staff and later SS liaison to the Wehrmacht, Wolff had his hands in nearly every back channel the SS operated. But while others waged ideological wars, Wolff quietly built a real estate portfolio, manipulated military contracts, and amassed a fortune behind a facade of loyalty. His greatest skill wasn't command, it was translation, turning vague decrees into profitable outcomes for himself and his associates. Need a construction deal routed through SS firms? Wolff could make it happen. Need a confiscated estate reassigned? Wolff knew a guy. His corruption was collaborative, the kind that required silence from many and benefited few. But Wolff's scheming remained relatively discreet, at least compared to the man who turned corruption into an institutional business model, running camps not just for terror, but for the spreadsheets they generated. 14. Oswald Pohl. Oswald Pohl turned the SS into a ledger book soaked in blood and lined with profit margins. As head of the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office, WVHA, Pohl engineered one of the largest forced labor profiteering systems in modern history, and skimmed it with bureaucratic precision. He managed everything from construction firms to quarries, brickworks, and weapons plants, all of which operated under the cheerful motto of self-sufficiency and ideological duty. But behind every invoice was theft. Behind every contract, favoritism. Slave labor wasn't just tolerated, it was cost-effective. Pohl's genius lay in making cruelty look like balance sheets. Resources flowed in, lives were extinguished, and profits quietly surged upward. And in the background, Pohl ensured that friends of the SS and himself got the best cuts. Yet even Pohl, with all his paperwork and euphemisms, couldn't match the raw, feral greed of a man who ran his camp like a casino where the house always won. 15. Amon Goth. Amon Goth didn't steal to enrich a system. He stole because he wanted to live like a king in the ruins. As commandant of the Poichouf camp, Goeth operated with unchecked authority and no discernible restraint. He seized homes, hoarded valuables, stockpiled looted goods, and ran black market operations so flagrant that even the SS, not exactly known for financial ethics, took notice. Goeth's corruption wasn't strategic, it was compulsive. He treated human lives like currency, bartered with fear, and built a daily routine around self-indulgence, masked as discipline. Inventories vanished, records were forged, and missing supplies were somehow always accounted for. In Goeth's basement. His downfall came not from conscience or justice, but from embarrassing the wrong people. He made theft look bad. He was a liability. So, when the SS itself decides you're too corrupt to continue, what comes next? a commandant whose fraud was so systemic, even his execution couldn't bury the paperwork. 16. Karl Koch. Karl Koch was so corrupt, even the SS couldn't cover for him. And that's saying something. As commandant of Buchenwald, Koch turned the camp into a personal piggy bank, complete with extortion rings, stolen property auctions, and an accounting system that looked like it had been written in invisible ink. He didn't just steal from victims, he stole from the Reich itself, siphoning resources that were supposed to fuel the war machine and funneling them into his grotesque little empire of bribes and fraud. His abuses were so flagrant, so sloppy, that the SS launched an internal investigation. Not because they had a moral compass, but because Koch's embezzlement was too noisy, too visible, too amateur. When his crimes began to damage SS prestige, they did what every paranoid bureaucracy does. They cleaned house. But while Koch was executed to make the scandal disappear, the system that enabled him didn't vanish. It simply promoted someone who could steal with more discretion and far more volume. 17. Richard Glucks. Richard Glucks was the kind of bureaucrat who could make a crime look like a policy memo. As the inspector of concentration camps under the SS, Glucks oversaw an empire of forced labor, logistical theft, and resource misallocation so vast that it could only be understood in numbers, most of them falsified. He managed the infrastructure that kept goods flowing out of camps and into the hands of Reich-connected corporations, loyal party members, and of course, SS leadership. Glucks didn't scream for attention like Koch or Guth. He operated quietly, shuffling prisoners like commodities and budgets like roulette chips. He streamlined corruption into efficiency reports. Under his watch, camps didn't just produce suffering, they produced quotas. Profits were logged, losses erased, and accountability diffused across a fog of forged documents and polite silence. But corruption wasn't confined to the camps. Outside the fences, one Gauleiter ran his province like a medieval fiefdom, with even less oversight. 18. Erich Koch. Erich Koch governed East Prussia and later Reichskommissariat Ukraine with the subtlety of a wrecking ball and the morals of a loan shark. He didn't just take bribes, he built institutions around them. Land redistribution, a cover for seizure, resource allocation, a tool for favoritism, infrastructure projects, fronts for contracts funneled to cronies. Koch enriched himself so blatantly that even Nazi officials complained, though mostly because his looting got in the way of their own. His rule was a showcase of violent dysfunction disguised as policy, a crash course in how to destroy a region while getting very rich in the process. The more he stole, the more unstable his territories became, which ironically increased his budget, which he then plundered again. He turned war into a subsidy. But Koch wasn't the only Gauleiter treating conquest as a get-rich-quick scheme. Just west of him, another regional boss was cashing in on chaos with the same brutal efficiency. 19. Albert Forster. Albert Forster ruled Danzig, West Prussia like it was his personal inheritance, one he didn't pay for but expected everyone else to finance. As Gauleiter, Forster's brand of corruption was rooted in a ruthless blend of racial ideology and real estate speculation. His policies of Germanization conveniently doubled as land grabs, where confiscated Polish and Jewish properties were handed out like party favors to loyalists, or quietly folded into his own estate portfolio. Forster wasn't loud about his greed. He let bureaucracy do the talking. Decrees were signed, records adjusted, and suddenly whole neighborhoods belonged to the Reich, and to him. He enriched himself by turning ideology into paperwork, and paperwork into deeds. Under his rule, the local economy was hollowed out for personal gain, and administrative chaos was spun into a political shield. But if Forster played the long game of corruption, his neighboring Gauleiter played the same game, only faster, louder, and with fewer fingerprints left behind. 20. Arthur Greiser. Arthur Greiser treated Warthegau like a sandbox for sadists and speculators. As Gauleiter, he turned ethnic cleansing into a property shuffle and governance into a smokescreen for personal enrichment. Unlike Forster, who operated through sleight of hand, Greiser wielded corruption like a hammer, straightforward, brutal, and always self-serving. He stripped Polish and Jewish communities of their assets, then sold, gifted, or absorbed the spoils through layers of fake auctions and puppet intermediaries. Factories were seized and handed to Nazi allies. Bank accounts discovered during population transfers became state property, which just happened to end up funding pet projects. Greiser's corruption wasn't an aberration. It was the system working exactly as designed, just faster. He knew how to turn violence into dividends and bureaucracy into a wall of plausible deniability. But his wealth-building machine needed labor, and the man responsible for delivering it was next in line, bringing with him an entire racket built on bodies and quotas. 21. Fritz Sauckel. Fritz Sauckel styled himself as the Labor Allocation General, which sounds like a mid-level HR title. Until you realize his real job was feeding the Nazi economy with millions of forced laborers. And feed it he did, with the ruthless efficiency of a man who saw people as inventory and supply chains as bank accounts. Sauckel managed massive labor networks across Europe, and wherever he went, corruption followed. Work contracts were forged, transportation budgets disappeared, and those deemed unfit were offloaded without record, or absorbed into private projects that had nothing to do with the war effort and everything to do with personal profit. Sauckel's subordinates were granted wide discretion, which translated into backdoor deals, kickbacks, and untraceable wealth. His office became a revolving door of functionaries with dirty hands and clean ledgers. But he didn't work alone. High-level ministries helped turn labor exploitation into official policy, and one man in particular built his entire bureaucratic career around monetizing obedience. 22. Wilhelm Frick. Wilhelm Frick was the Nazi regime's legal architect, and like any good architect, he knew how to design exits, loopholes, and hidden compartments. As Minister of the Interior, Frick had sweeping control over civil administration, law enforcement, and municipal appointments. That meant every position he handed out was also an opportunity for loyalty, for profit, and for leverage. He structured policies that centralized power while decentralizing accountability, creating layers of officials who owed their careers, and sometimes their fortunes, to him. Frick's genius wasn't in loud corruption, but in systemic manipulation. He rerouted funds, shielded cronies, and ensured that national decrees came with personal perks. His ministry became a back-channel empire where regulations were rewritten to serve those who played by his private rulebook. But where Frick used laws to enrich allies, his youthful counterpart ran an entire cultural empire with party money. And he did it with a boyish smile and a budget built on blind ideology. 23. Baldur von Schirach. Baldur von Schirach sold himself as the future of Germany, but the only thing he consistently invested in was himself. As leader of the Hitler Youth, von Schirach commanded millions of young minds, and an enormous budget that he plundered with performative patriotism. Uniforms, camps, rallies, training centers, all funded by the state and ripe for exploitation. Vendors were handpicked, contracts inflated, and procurement turned into a corrupt carousel where loyalty outweighed quality and kickbacks were expected. Von Schirach surrounded himself with a clique of opportunists who used ideological education as a smokescreen for self-dealing. While children marched in perfectly timed formations, the adults in charge were cashing in behind the curtain. Later, as Gauleiter of Vienna, his corruption only deepened. Cultural programs turned into vanity projects. Deportations doubled as real estate transfers. But his brand of civic theft paled in comparison to the man sent north, to Norway, where corruption wore a uniform and smiled behind mirrored sunglasses. 24. Joseph Terboven. Joseph Terboven arrived in Norway with a mission: bring the Reich to Scandinavia. What he brought instead was a wrecking ball. As Reichskommissar of Norway, Terboven governed with unchecked authority and treated his post like a colonial governor with delusions of grandeur. He seized homes, silenced opposition, and redirected Norwegian industry to line the pockets of both himself and his closest collaborators. Occupation budgets disappeared into construction projects with suspicious accounting. Confiscated goods were rerouted into private residences. Even natural resources were exploited not just for the war effort, but for economic side deals Terboven orchestrated under the table. He created a brutal patronage network that rewarded obedience with land, contracts, and impunity. His rule left Norway economically ravaged and politically fractured, but also personally profitable. Yet even Terboven, with all his borrowed power and petty tyranny, couldn't match the violent chaos soon unleashed by a younger Gauleiter whose ambitions drowned in his own excess. 25. Karl Hanke. Karl Hanke was the kind of bureaucrat who treated every assignment like a performance, and every civilian as expendable. As Gauleiter of Lower Silesia, Hanke ran his region with theatrical cruelty and a businessman's instinct for personal gain. He wasn't just corrupt in the usual sense, he was innovative about it. Factories were commandeered and handed to SS-affiliated firms. Food and fuel allocations were rebalanced to reward party loyalists. Public resources disappeared into emergency use accounts that no one could audit. Hanke oversaw massive evacuations and industrial relocations, and each one came with a paper trail that somehow ended at his own doorstep. He knew the war was ending, and he treated his final months in power like a liquidation sale, grabbing whatever he could before the roof collapsed. It did, but before it did, the military still had its own merchants of corruption, including a decorated general who traded medals for privilege and requisitions for quiet theft. 26. Hermann Göring as military leader. If Hermann Göring was the regime's crown prince of corruption and politics, he was its emperor in uniform. As head of the Luftwaffe and director of the four-year plan, Göring didn't just oversee industrial plunder, he engineered it. Entire sectors of the German economy were brought under his control, from coal and steel to synthetic fuels and rubber. Every contract, every raw material, every logistical route had a toll gate, and Göring owned the keys. He positioned himself at the nexus of war production and war profiteering, awarding deals to firms that paid loyalty in gold and silence in shares. The Luftwaffe itself became a bloated monument to inefficiency, riddled with overpriced contracts, underperforming equipment, and personal indulgences. The more the military strained, the more Göring's empire swelled. But he wasn't the only general treating occupied territories as hunting grounds. Another officer, praised for his discipline, quietly built his fortune under the fog of war and the cover of requisition slips. 27. Walter von Reichenau. Walter von Reichenau had a reputation for being pragmatic, loyal, and ruthless. Three traits that also made him exceptionally good at profiting from chaos. As commander of the 6th Army and a key player in the Eastern Front, Reichenau's operations were marked not just by violence, but by resource appropriation that consistently blurred the line between strategic necessity and blatant theft. Under his command, armies requisitioned supplies far beyond operational need. Entire convoys of food, livestock, clothing, and vehicles vanished from occupied territories, often redirected into German black markets or sold off by officers within his chain of command. Reichenau allowed, and sometimes encouraged, policies that benefited his inner circle materially. His ideological fervor was always conveniently paired with economic extraction. But Reichenau's operation looked tame next to another general whose corruption was less about ideology and more about personal comfort, a man who saw the military front as a blank check with no expiration date. 28. Gerd von Rundstedt. Gerd von Rundstedt was often portrayed as the gentleman general, old school, polished, above the ideological fray. But under the veneer of military tradition was a commander who knew exactly how to benefit from occupation without getting his boots muddy. Von Rundstedt oversaw vast territories on the eastern and western fronts, where plunder masqueraded as logistics and requisitions blurred into looting. While he maintained plausible deniability, his subordinates ran rampant, enriching themselves through seized goods, black market exchanges, and resource diversion. Von Rundstedt didn't need to issue orders. He simply allowed the system to run, knowing full well what it produced. Wine cellars were emptied, estates were repurposed, and entire supply chains were quietly rerouted. It was corruption by omission, framed as military necessity. He saw himself as too dignified for direct theft, but somehow always lived comfortably near the spoils. And behind the front lines, another man turned requisition into an art form, armed not with medals, but spreadsheets and shipping manifests. 29. Edward Wagner. Edward Wagner wasn't a frontline commander. He didn't shout orders over battlefields or bask in wartime glory. He was the quartermaster general, the man who made the trains run, the supplies flow, and the money move. And in that quiet technical position, he built a shadow empire of corruption. Wagner controlled military logistics across vast occupied territories, giving him de facto power over food, fuel, clothing, and transportation. He played the long game of procurement manipulation, overstocking here, underreporting there, redirecting assets under euphemisms like reassignment. Resources disappeared and reappeared in odd places, often in private hands or friendly corporate inventories. He wasn't flashy, but he was effective. Wagner understood that corruption thrived best when disguised as routine. His name rarely surfaced in scandals, yet his fingerprints were everywhere. But while Wagner kept his crimes tidy, one SS commander saw no need for subtlety and used the burning of a city as cover for theft on a scale that defied even Nazi standards. 30. Heinz Rheinefeld. Heinz Rheinefeld earned infamy for what his troops did during the Warsaw Uprising, but behind the atrocity was a different kind of theft. Opportunistic, unrestrained, and deeply lucrative. As commander of SS forces in Warsaw, Rheinefeld presided over an orgy of plunder disguised as counterinsurgency. His units systematically looted valuables from homes, churches, and public buildings. Gold, artwork, furniture, documents, all boxed, cataloged, and shipped back to the Reich, or simply pocketed by officers. Rheinefeld claimed to be restoring order. In truth, he was overseeing organized pillage. Convoys labeled as military freight were stuffed with civilian assets. What couldn't be moved was destroyed, but not before being sifted for anything worth fencing. He built his post-war career on silence, but records later showed he'd personally intervened to secure high-value items under the guise of security. And while most SS officers looted by instinct, one general took a different approach, laundering corruption through ideology and foreign volunteers who owed him everything. 31. Felix Steiner. Felix Steiner liked to think of himself as a soldier's soldier, principled, professional, and apolitical. But beneath that well-groomed image lay a man who knew how to turn ideology into opportunity. As a high-ranking SS general and architect of the foreign volunteer divisions, Steiner managed recruitment, training, and deployment of tens of thousands of troops from across Europe. That meant contracts, uniforms, equipment, logistics. And with each came the chance to skim, redirect, and favor. Steiner was deeply involved in the structuring of the Waffen-SS's multinational forces, which allowed him to build patronage networks that rewarded loyalty not with ideology, but with access to promotions, contracts, and sometimes land. Foreign officers were often treated as bargaining chips, and procurement systems became riddled with inflated costs and missing inventories. He walked the line between military necessity and quiet enrichment, always just clean enough to avoid scandal. But the next man wasn't nearly as careful. He sat near the heart of the high command and made corruption part of the operational playbook. 32. Alfred Jodl. Alfred Jodl wasn't a frontline general or a camp commandant. He was the strategist behind the curtain. the man who stood beside Hitler at briefings and translated fantasy into orders. As chief of the operations staff of the Wehrmacht High Command, Jodl controlled vast administrative levers of war. And within those levers were contracts, logistics decisions, and the power to influence who got what, when, and for how much. Jodl used this influence not for ideological purity or military efficiency, but for favors and quiet kickbacks. Defense contractors were hand-picked. Resource allocations favored certain regions, not for tactical reasons, but because the right people whispered in the right ears. He maintained an image of cold detachment, but beneath the uniform was a man who understood how to capitalize on proximity to power. His corruption was less visible, but no less corrosive. Still, for all his maneuvering, the true foundation of Nazi economic dysfunction had been laid years earlier, by a man in a suit, not a uniform. 33. Hjalmar Schacht. Hjalmar Schacht was never a party fanatic. He wore three-piece suits, not armbands. But few men did more to enable the Nazi rise to power, and profit from it, than he did. As president of the Reichsbank and later Minister of Economics, Schacht was the mastermind behind the financial sleight of hand that funded Germany's rearmament while pretending the economy was stable. Through elaborate credit schemes, shadow budgets, and state-backed fronts like MIFO bills, he built a system where accountability was vaporized and cronyism reigned. Business elites got rich, party loyalists got contracts, and oversight became a historical footnote. Schacht claimed later to have opposed Hitler, but not before enabling the very machinery that made corruption not only possible, but structurally inevitable. He didn't steal openly. He legalized theft. And with him, the list ends. But the moral rot he helped unleash would outlive them all, proving that even the most brutal regimes can be undone from within, one quiet transaction at a time.